and studying than I ever did sitting out as a student in the classroom. So I really like it. I have the tendency to go in depth in a lot of different things, and I kind of like to look at unique or interesting things that maybe you hadn't thought of, or maybe you had, I don't know, and leave maybe more of the more obvious stuff not cover that as much. I don't know, perhaps maybe that doesn't make sense, but maybe it will as we get into this. That doesn't mean that that you can't ask questions, and certainly, or talk about something that's on your mind or something that I didn't cover. Please feel free to do that at any time here today. So we've been here, like I said, since July. We started. If you actually lived out in Plano, we were driving here, and everyone was still meeting in the auditorium, and then we finally moved out here. June. We were out there in June, and we finally moved out to Keller in July. And then I work out at Lockheed at the plant currently now. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to study 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's a lot of stuff to get through. The one other thing I should tell you that I'm used to in my classes, they never ended. And what I mean by that is I took as much time as I wanted. I talked as long as I wanted. If my class went on for a year, which they had sometimes, then I would talk and teach a class for a year. And so I'm not really used to staying to a timeline and getting through 13 weeks and then it being over. So I may have some problems with that. I just warn you again up front that you guys can hopefully help me. I got a booklet that will hopefully help me keep you on track, but I'm just not used to that. I'm used to just taking as long as I need and talking as long as I want and interacting about it. And as long as it takes, as long as it takes. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not so good, I don't know. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, obviously this is, for those who are not as familiar, right, we're in the kind of the period of the judges, right, the judges are coming to an end now. In fact, Samuel was really the last judge of Israel. And that time frame was about 350 years that lasted, which, just to kind of put that in perspective for us today, especially here as Americans, right, we've been a country for less than 250 years, even here in America. So just think about that for a second, right? I mean, you think America's like, hey, we've been around for a long time. I mean, the judges period is around 350 or so years that occurs by the time Samuel. So we don't know exactly what it is because the dates aren't clear, and there may have been some overlap in some of the judges and where they were in the different regions. But it's fairly accurate around there, around 350 years. So Samuel's going to be the last one here, and he's going to be a special individual, right? He's going to be called by God, and we're going to look at today. In fact, the first part of Samuel we're looking at is just the first 3 chapters. I don't know if anybody read the 1st Samuel or not before they came in today. Hopefully you did. I didn't tell you beforehand the books that the chapter we've been looking at, but those are the ones we're looking at for today, and the next time we'll look at the Ark. And those are 4 through 7, and when it was taken and then finally returned back to Jerusalem. But anyway, so we're going to look at Samuel and where he's from and where it all came about and started with his ministry to the Israelites for that. So if you have your Bibles and you want to turn, we're going to open and read from 1 Samuel. I'm going to first read just the first part of it, and then I'll selectively pick a few things as we go through, and we'll look at some stuff. All right, so here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 1. Now there was a certain man, and I may butcher some of these words, so I apologize if I do that. Rothaim Zophim, I think is how you say that, the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Now, before we get moving on too far from there, some of the things that one of the classes that I taught in California was, alleged Bible discrepancies, and there's many books have been written about them. In fact, The Hammer and Anvil by, I apologize, what's his guy's name? Not Kyle Budge, but Derek Lyons. Derek Lyons wrote an excellent set of books. If you've not read them, they're really good to deal with a lot of that type of stuff. And one of the things that sometimes gets brought up even here, when you look at this, right? One, Samuel is going to be what? What is Samuel going to be? when he is born and dedicated? What does he do?
Judge.
He's a judge, yeah, but no, what does he do initially? Where does Hannah take him to dedicate him and give him to the temple, right? He's a priest. Samuel's a priest, right? That's where so where did the priest come from? What tribe? The Levite tribe, right? But it says here that Elkanah was an Ephraimite, which is interesting, right? Because he should be a Levite, right? If that's where Samuel's going to come and he should be a Levite. Well, is he a Levite? Actually, yes, he is, right? So this is kind of what I was talking about, some of the interesting things that are in the Bible, as I mentioned before. And again, I did not necessarily come up with this on my own. Again, this was something that Brother Jackson brought up. I was reading a neat article about it last night. And if you go back and look, it turns out that Elkanah is in fact a Levite. He finds his lineage, and you can go back and look at that from Kohath and on down, who was a son of Levi, and one of Kohath was one of Elkanah's ancestors. But it turned out that Kohath lived in the area of Ephraim. And if you notice at the beginning, it talks about that the certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, which is, we'll talk about that later on, the mountains of Ephraim, that's where he is. So it's about his geology. It's kind of like I'm a Texan, right? You know, I'm from Texas. That's, you know, geographically where I'm from. But I can also be what? A Christian. You can be a Christian anywhere. You don't have to be a Christian in Texas or in, you know, California or somewhere. So that's the same idea here that's talked about that. So he is actually lives up in Ephraim, but he is a Levite, which is something that is interesting there as well. So that's the first thing that I was going to want to talk about. And then in verse 2, it says, and he had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it was year by year that she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her, therefore she wept and did not eat. So this is a very interesting part of the scripture, and really important, actually. First, we notice, and although not unusual, that Elkanah is a polygamist, right? He has more than one wife, which obviously we know in the Old Testament times that is not something that was unusual. But I would ask the question, one, I know there are many who bring charges against the Bible that would claim, oh, you know, they did all this type of stuff. Abraham lied, and David did this and that and the other thing, right? So did God condone or think that that was the right thing to do? I guess that'd be the question that I would ask. Who here thinks that God said, yep, that was good, he thought that was the way to go, and anybody think that in the room? I don't see any hands raised, which is good. So the answer is no, of course, right? We know from the beginning, right, in Genesis, that God, had intended for it to be what? A man and a woman. And then man decided that they were going to do things. There's lots of stuff in the Old Testament, especially, or even in the New Testament, where the Bible just does what? It declares facts. It just says something. It doesn't put a judgment on it. It doesn't say if it's right or if it's wrong. It just says, oh, by the way, he had two wives. It doesn't say, and God was pleased with that. It doesn't say that God was displeased with that either. But the truth of the matter is that God worked within the way that man decided to go about their business, which was incorrect. And interestingly, this was something that I had not really thought of, but something that the booklet had talked about that helped prepare for the class. Can you think of a single polygamous relationship in the Old Testament that worked out well? Name one. any of them. One that comes to mind, like, oh yeah, no, that worked out great. There was no fighting between the wives, and they were all friends, and everything was awesome. And the book I claimed, and I haven't gone to look at it, but from my recollection and when I started to think about it, I can't think of a single time where it actually was good, where there was peace and the family unit works together like they really were supposed to. It just doesn't work. It wasn't the way God intended it to work. And in fact, even in this example here that we see, that there are times here, of course, where Peninnah is really ribbing Hannah, right? Like hard. Like, in fact, that's what that term means, where it says that her rival also provoked her severely, like, made fun of her, condemned her. Why? Because she couldn't have children, right? It was part of the reason. But there may be another reason why. Why else may Peninnah have ribbed Hannah?
That was the favorite.
Yeah, right? So perhaps, even though Elkanah probably thought he was doing something good, right, by giving Hannah a double portion when it came time to go up and sacrifice, Peninnah probably took that the wrong way as well, right? Oh, well, he likes her more, but she's not delivering, right? She's not delivering, literally, the goods. But I am, and she's still here getting the double portion, and we're sitting over here, and we're not, right? So we're setting up perhaps, again, we're not told, but you can imagine, right, the way that humans are, that's probably partly what's going on, right? That she feels a little jaded by that, because Hannah's looked at more favorably than she is, even though she's the one who has children. And obviously, especially in the Old Testament times, and quite honestly, even today, really, I believe, some may disagree with me, but women mostly want to have children. A lot of them do, not every one of them, but a lot of them do, and that they really like to do that when they get married and they want to have kids. And certainly back then, it was very important, right? It is, I think, even today, right? That's the one way that you procreate and continue to have a society, right? The family unit. In fact, if you go look, one of the major indicators that will talk about how well a country is doing, they'll look at birth rates, and the family sizes. And what they want it to look like is basically like a triangle. It's a perfect one, or a pyramid, if you will, right? When it's oldest to youngest. And so the most people are, the young babies, most of those, you have the least really old 100-year-olds, and then it's basically even. And then you get, like, when you get in real problems is when you start getting an upside down pyramid. What does that mean? The country's about to be gone. Like a generation from now, it may not be here anymore, because there won't be anybody there, right? Or the opposite, right? Where you can see where there's going to be, it's like a really flat pancake, and then they're just all kids, and like, how do you take care of that? Right? You don't have enough people working to maintain the society. Does that make sense? Anyways, there's a lot of different things you go look at for that, but it is interesting. And then, of course, in the Old Testament times, having children was really important, right? And it was a statute, and even the Bible talked about it, right? The man whose quiver is full, speaking of babies or children, is going to be held, right? So there is certainly that going on, but it is interesting, the dynamic that is occurring there. And what's a little more interesting is even Elkanah's statement to his wife, Hannah, in verse 8, where he says, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Well, most of the time, the men certainly in this time frame, wanted their wives to have children. And so it would be a little unusual to hear Elkanah say something like that. Now, perhaps he's just trying to comfort her and he doesn't necessarily believe it. I don't know. I wouldn't think that to be true. But the Bible describes and talks about it and says that, hey, look, am I not good enough for you, basically, to be just your husband? You don't need to necessarily have children. I love you, in fact, even more. It doesn't say that, but it appears based upon the way he treats her, then Peninnah. So that's a very interesting thing to notice as well. And so Hannah is distraught, right? And every year they go up to Shiloh, which is another thing that's interesting, right? So they go up to Shiloh to do what? Why are they going to Shiloh? Does anyone know? Anyone remember? This is what I think is actually really good. So don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have remembered half of this stuff if I hadn't studied before coming to this class. But I do love the Old Testament. I have studied it a lot. I think it's really great to go back and get knowledge and understand. I don't think you can really even understand the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament. And so I think even some of these little facts and going back are really important to look at. So do you have your hand up there, David?
I believe the Shiloh, the tabernacle was there. At that
Yeah,
time.
right, exactly, right. So remember, is there a Jerusalem right now? Well, yes, but not the temple in Jerusalem. Right? Has a temple been built? But who builds a temple? Who builds the first temple that we think of? Like no big huge structure. Come on, we know this. David doesn't. Solomon did, right? David wanted to. I said, no, you had too much blood in it, right? Solomon built it. Is Solomon around? No, of course not, right? Because we're still in the period of the judges, right? So Saul hasn't even become king. David hasn't become king, and Solomon surely isn't king yet. So the Israelites, right? They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They've exited the wilderness, and now they're setting up in the land, right? This is a period of the judges where they conquered the land, and now they're living in that period, right? And so when they were kind of done conquering, what had happened was Joshua had set up in Shiloh the tabernacle, the tent, or what also is called the temple as well. Even back then, there's some, you go and read, people say, well, how did Solomon build the first temple? It said, that they went up and they went to go make an offering at the temple. I think they say it later on, or the tabernacle. How did he build the first one? Well, it's called that in multiple different ways. The bottom line is this was the cloth one that you remember from when Moses had first built it and the Israelites traveled, and then they finally established and built. That's what this is in Shiloh. That's where they're going to worship. That is where the tabernacle lives and why they're going up to Shiloh at this point. Just something interesting as well. So then we see here that they go to Shiloh as they did every year, as they were commanded to do. And Hannah is, as we saw there, is weeping and is fasting, evidently in verse 6 and 7, from being distraught about not having any kids and then being kind of made fun of by Peninnah about it. And then they go and she decides she's going to make what's called a vow. And this is really pretty interesting. And if you go, I'm not going to go into this because I don't think we have time right now, but if you want to underline vow in your Bible and above it write Numbers 30, you go back to Numbers 30 and you can read all about the vows and what a vow meant and what it meant if a man made a vow or a woman made a vow. So there are distinct differences between the two of them. And you can go read them. But ultimately, the bottom line, to give it away, the bottom line was if a man made a vow, he had to do it. There was no getting out of it. There was no nothing. If a woman made a vow, then it depended. If she was still under her father's house and her father heard it and didn't say anything, then it stood. If he said, no, you're not going to do that, then it didn't, then she wasn't bound to the vow. Or if she was married and she made a vow and her husband heard it and then just stood by and said, oh, yeah, okay, sounds good to me, and didn't say anything, then she had to do it. Or vice versa, if he said, no, we're not going to do that, then she wasn't bound to the vow. And then, of course, if you were a widower or if they were not, for whatever reason, not under their father's house, it would be highly unusual. So really, it was just a widower, then they were bound to do it, just as if the man was. So you can go read a little bit about that if you want in Numbers chapter 30. But the bottom line is, here you see Hannah that basically is crying out to the Lord in her affliction. And we'll read it. It says in verse 11, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor will come upon his head. And so she's really just pouring out her soul to God right here, right? And telling like, look, God, I want a kid more than anything. And even if you give me one, I'm going to give him back to you. If you give me a son, I'm going to give him back to you, and he will serve you. And she even puts a time frame on it, forever. basically, right? As far as like, as long as he lives, as long as he's alive, he is going to be yours. And then she makes another interesting claim, and she says, and the razor shall not come upon his head. Does anyone know what that is describing or talking about?
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know who said that, but the Nazarite vow, that's correct. And does anybody know who was one of the famous ones that everybody thinks of the Nazarite vow, right? Samson, right? Everybody thinks Nazarite. Oh, Samson, right? Yes, and he is one of them that had it. But does anybody know what else was a part of the Nazarite vow? Do you remember? Really, kind of three distinct things that go into the vow. We know one is not the hair, right? So we're obvious about that, right? They don't cut any of the hair while they're doing the vow. There's something, yeah, so both of you are right. Yes, so there is a diet issue, and then there's also, and then there's unclean, but there's a specific unclean thing. Dead people, yes, right? So if someone died, they could go nowhere near them, even if it was one of their own family members. In fact, you could call out specifically your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister. They listed them all. Like if there was any confusion, no, you can't go near them. And in fact, if you just happen to be standing next to somebody and they just up and died, then they had to go through this whole process to get cleansed again. To redo that. But the other one was a diet. Does anybody remember the diet restriction?
No wine or strong drink.
Correct. But even more so, no what? Not only just wine or strong drink, which wine can mean different things. So fruit of the vine. Like they couldn't even eat grapes or the skin or anything. It was very specific. They couldn't go anywhere near grapes or fruit of the vine, right? At all. And normally it was for a time period. The vow would be for a certain time, right? They would serve and go do that. Not necessarily that it would be for the whole life, but I guess it could. I don't know. I don't know that there is one that's like that. Maybe Samson was an example of it, but yeah. So that was the Nazarite vow. That was the razor shall not come on her head. So now this is interesting, right? Eli is there. She's obviously. Hannah is in the temple. Eli sees her, and what does he see? Do you guys remember? He sees her there, and she's like obviously distraught and doing something. And her mouth is moving or trembling, and in fact, it says there in verse 12, it says Eli washed her mouth. That means like he studied it carefully. Is what is being done. Like he's looking at her intently, like what's going on. And evidently there's no word. She's saying this all in her head, and she's not like uttering it. So either she's mouthing it, or maybe her lips are trembling. Something is going on. But whatever it is, Eli jumps to a conclusion pretty erroneously, right? And he thinks what? That she's drunk, which is a very interesting statement, right? It says something. What does it tell us? It tells us a few things, right? People got drunk back then. We know that. So that tells us that, right? It was a thing. And evidently people got drunk and went to the temple. That happened, right? Eli evidently maybe had seen it before. Otherwise, they're like, what's going on? Who is this person, right? If he'd seen something like this, right? Had happened before out there. And that maybe there was some partying happening that shouldn't have been going on when they were drinking and eating and everything else the night prior. Anyway, just some things to think about, right? Just that one little statement. It turns out, of course, that she obviously was not drunk. And she said, no, I'm not drunk. I'm just really distraught. I don't have any child. I really want a child. I'm praying to God. And I'm certain, I can only imagine, right? Eli is the high priest of Israel, that Hannah knew who he was. Like, she had to have known. It would be like, President Trump, right? I mean, whether you liked him or you didn't like him or whatever, you knew who he was, right? I mean, you just knew who Eli was. It would have been really strange for her not to know who Eli was. And so it's interesting, though, after he condemns her, which is something that we should be careful of. It's not mentioned or talked about here, although I will say he corrects it, but the whole situation really should never have happened to begin with, in my opinion. Right? Eli could have handled that much better instead of just assuming things, which is oftentimes where we find ourselves getting into trouble as well, when we assume things. But then in verse 17, he says, Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him," which really encouraged Hannah, right? Really encouraged her. In fact, so much so, in verse 18, it says, "And she said, 'Let your maidservant find favor in your sight.' So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad." Right? She was very encouraged to get those words from Eli after being rebuked initially. Because one, I'm assuming, again, we're talking about she knew who he was, the high priest, probably assumed that he was a godly man who was close to God. And so if you were to say something like, "The God of Israel grant your request," well, maybe it's really going to happen. Because Eli, the high priest, is advocating on my behalf, right? I don't know what she's thinking. We're not told exactly. I'm just kind of getting in her mind. I think it probably would have happened. Whatever it was, she says, she makes it clear, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight," in Eli's sight, not necessarily in the sight of God per se, although certainly she was interested in that by both this prayer and then the one in chapter 2. And then she goes away and starts eating. She's no longer fasting, and she's no longer sad as well. And then in verse 19, and we'll just talk about that, "They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house at Ramah." And by the way, Ramah is a short word for Ramathim Zophim from before the beginning of the book. That's just a shorter name for that. Okay, so they've got up and worshiped God, which was, of course, the whole reason why they had gone to Shiloh to begin with, right? Was to worship God. And so I can only imagine what that Hannah probably had said a similar prayer that she had earlier, again, that same morning. And then, of course, we're told that they have marital relations, that Hannah does, in fact, conceive a son and names him Samuel. So do you guys remember from Corey's lesson what Samuel stood for? The name actually means?
I have asked for him from the Lord.
Yeah, or called by God is another one. Or I can't remember the exact specific. It's a combination of two, but the bottom line is, yes, she had asked for him, and the Lord delivered. And when she had weaned him, she brought him back to Eli, which this is to me, was really interesting. The child was probably pretty young weaned. I don't know, 2, 3 years old, maybe. I mean, 4 probably at the oldest at this point. And it just is just strange to me, right? She brings. I mean, there obviously was something set up for this, but I can't imagine. How she brings him, gives him to Eli. Like, what is Eli going to do with the little baby? Like, little kid. Like, where did he go? Like, that's like the questions, right, for me that I'm like, what does Samuel do? Like, from the time that he was 3 or 4 until, when we basically jump right into chapter 3 here later on. Like, who was taking care of him? There had to have been a woman, I'm assuming, somewhere in there. We know there were women that helped in the temple, and I'm assuming that's part of what it was. It's just very interesting to me, just, that whole process. And then also the trust that must have been put in for Hannah to just go and give your child to Eli. And it's probably, even at this point, fairly well known. In fact, it's interesting because even way back in the beginning, we're not told much yet, but in verse 3, it says, "Also the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas," which we know are not good people, really not good. She probably knows about them as well and knows what's going on. And she's, well, Eli's their dad. Kids are running amok, going crazy, right? Yet she still honors her vow to God and brings Samuel to Eli, and along with some other sacrifices as well for that. So anyway, it's just something interesting. All right, that's chapter 1, and we're already way behind. We're not going to spend a whole lot in chapter 2, though. So, any questions or comments on chapter 1 or other things that somebody wants to bring up that I missed or?
No, I see this. Everything as a mom, in chapter, in verse 26, you know, I think about the faith that she had, not just to ask God for the baby, but then to put it and give the baby to somebody that, you know, she's not there, she doesn't know what's going on and all that. So, you know, when you read it, oh my Lord, you know, like, I see myself kind of like, you know, that prayer of,
Yeah.
you know, just take care of them because you have no idea what's going to happen, you know, but that faith that she has in God, you know,
Yep,
it's
she had made a vow and she's going to stand by, which is, again, really important, right? You know, to be a man or woman of your word. And so God gave her. And then it turns out, right, as we know later on, that he's going to bless her even more. Right? Give her 3 sons and 2 daughters. We're not going to read this, but in chapter 2, you know, basically, we're not told exactly what it is. I assume it's probably shortly after she delivers Samuel to Eli there. And you can go and read that if you want. It's a really good prayer. Something interesting is who she talks about when she's talking about the wicked and evil for that. But anyway, just some things to consider. And then later on in chapter 2, we see and we get an idea of what's going on with the sons of Eli. And what's more disturbing, I guess, is the fact that Eli really didn't do much about it. He knew what was going on, right? That the 2 sons were basically, they were disregarding the sacrifices, right? They were coming and taking, and was that a bell? Was there another one?
Yeah,
Okay. All right, got about 5 minutes, right. So they were coming and taking the sacrifices, and well, I knew I was going to run out of time. This is always how it goes. All right, and then ultimately God comes and talks, a man of God comes and talks to Eli and tells him, right? He tells him, Eli, what's going to happen. He says, look, you know, to paraphrase, and starting in verse 27 of chapter 2, you know, you're basically been a failure as a father to train your children up, but more importantly, because you've been a failure as a leader and a great high priest of Israel. Your sons are running amok, and you're doing nothing about it. Which is interesting because in the booklet it said, oh well, you know, Hophni and Phinehas were in charge of their own sins, and it wasn't charged to Eli. I'm like, yes and no. Yes, in that they were going to be responsible for their own sins, but yes, in the fact that Eli had a responsibility as a great high priest in order to discipline and get rid of that. That was his role as a leader. He needed to do something, and he did not. Is the bottom line, and that's why he is going to be. He's going to be told that basically his sons are going to die on the same day, and then not only that, his priesthood from his lineage is ultimately going to be taken away. That doesn't happen for many, many years under the reign of David. We'll talk about that later on. Actually, almost 130 years later is when it finally is fully prophesied about, or fully the prophecy is fully comes about for that. But also that all his descendants shall die, and if you look there in verse 33, all the men will cut off from your altar and consume your eyes, and the descendants of your house shall die in the flower age. You're not going to live long lives either, right? They're all going to die pretty young. And then comes chapter 3, right, where Samuel is basically in the temple. He's asleep. The Lord comes to him 3 times, and he continues to go to Eli and says, "You called me?" And Eli says, "No." And then finally Eli figures out it's the Lord that's calling him. Now it's interesting, in verse 6, it says, "Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him," which is interesting, right? So in other words, what that's saying is that Samuel did not recognize the voice of the Lord and how to respond to it, because he didn't know him yet. Now he was it was obvious he had been raised in the temple and grown up to be a godly man, but he didn't know. It's kind of the same way with us, though, right? Are we willing to hear and know the voice of the Lord? Listen to what his word has to say, and then as we grow, we'll get to know, right? What did Jesus talk about when he says he's a shepherd, right? And what hears his voice? The sheep, right? It's the exact same thing, right? The sheep know the shepherd's voice. In the same way that Eli did, but that Samuel is going to know the voice of the Lord eventually here later on. And now it's unclear what exactly that Samuel knew. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming Samuel was still probably pretty young at this time, maybe around 12, 13 or so, when the Lord appears to him. We're not told exactly. But I'm sure he's probably seen or gotten wind or knows that, Hophni and Phinehas aren't quite right. But he's told pretty bluntly and plainly from the Lord the same exact thing that Eli's told, basically, only in a little shorter, condensed version, right? That this is what's going to happen. He isn't told to go tell him, and in fact, Samuel's afraid, right? He's like, ooh. And he kind of avoids Eli. He just kind of goes about his business, just like, like maybe he's not going to see me. I'm not going to have to talk to him. And eventually, finally, Eli says, hey, where are you? Oh, I'm over here. He's like, tell me everything the Lord says. And if you don't, then I want all that stuff to come upon you if you don't tell me, which is really what he says to Samuel. And so Samuel complies and tells Eli everything, which I'm sure was very difficult for a young man to do, right? Because he was basically condemning Eli. Samuel probably did not know that a man of God had already come to Eli and told him all of it. Eli knew all of this, right? He wasn't going to tell Eli anything he didn't know. And perhaps, I don't know, we're not told, there was a test, I don't know, that to Eli to see if really that God had talked with him or to Samuel or not, right? Because no one else would have known that unless Eli went and told other people. So again, some interesting things to think about. And again, I know we're running out of time here. But the bottom line is, Eli accepted it. And if you read at the end there in verse 18, Samuel had nothing, told him everything, had nothing from him. And he being Eli, said, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. I heard the second bell here. The last thing I want to say before we go is bottom line, verses 19 through the end of the chapter, there are 3. Samuel continues to grow in stature. And if you notice there, it says in 19, Samuel grew in the Lord, and none of his words fell to the ground. What does that mean? That means everything Samuel said came true, or was accurate. If he came and told you something about your life, it was right. If he came and prophesied that something was going to happen, it happened. In other words, he was 100% correct, which is what? The standard for any prophet of God. 100%, never wrong, ever. And where does that come from? Deuteronomy 18, 21, and 22. You can go read that. It basically says, if they say something and it doesn't come to pass, I did not tell them that. If it happened once, that's it. They're always right. The prophets of God, 100%. Unlike many of the men today who claim again, there's a lot more that can be said about that. There's a whole lot of what we couldn't have said about a lot of this. I'm sorry, I'll try to do a little bit better about staying more on track, but I have a hard time because there's just so much good information really in here and a lot of stuff to talk about. We already have to go, so anyways, thank you and look forward to next week.